The day is October 9th, 1967. The place, a remote village in Bolivia. Surrounded, exhausted, and wounded, famed revolutionary guerrilla leader Che Guevara faced a group of Bolivian soldiers who had been hunting him for days and exclaimed, "Shoot, coward, you are only going to kill a man." The idea was that the ideals that Guevara fought for would live on long after him. The Bolivians fired, killing the man who in many ways had been the bane of not only the military dictatorships of Latin America and Africa, but of the United States as well. Next, the soldiers displayed his body in the village and photographed it, and themselves next to it. As an added humiliation, they cut the hands off of Guevara's body and sent them to the Bolivian High Command. Fingerprints don't lie, and the Bolivians and many other people did not want rumors of Guevara still alive in the mountains to be a rallying cry for more guerrilla activity. For a time, Che Guevara was one of the most wanted men in the world. He was target number one for the many Latin American nations who were experiencing differing levels of communist insurgencies in the 50s and 60s. Of all the communist leaders in the world, Che was perhaps the most charismatic, and therefore dangerous. Not only were people drawn to his personality and intellect, including many non-communists, but Che was a dangerous man to his enemies. Along with Fidel Castro, who he had met in Mexico City in 1955, Che became one of the military leaders of Cuba's communist revolution and pulled off a stunning victory in the capture of the city of Santa Clara in 1959, despite being outnumbered 10-1. During his time in the field, Guevara wrote what is now almost required reading for both counterinsurgency planners and revolutionaries worldwide, a military manual with the simple title, Guerrilla Warfare. Welcome to a day in history. Today, the rapid rise and violent end of Che Guevara, hero to millions and villain to millions of others. Che Guevara was 39 years old when he was killed. He had gone from the son of a left-leaning entrepreneur and businessman in that short life. Che's real name was Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, which reflected his mother's and father's family names. In actuality, Che's father, also named Ernesto, often added another name, Lynch, after his 4 times great-grandfather Patrick Lynch, who migrated to Argentina in 1749. For most of his public life, Che was popular in the Republic of Ireland and with the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, the largest revolutionary group fighting the British for Northern Irish Union with the rest of the island nation. In the 50s and 60s, it was popular for communist and radical revolutionaries to use war names, what is often referred to by the French term nom de guerre. This was not only used to hide a person's real identity, but also to imitate the Soviet leader, Joseph Djougashvili Stalin, the man of steel. But his comrades gave Ernesto the name Che, for the unique Argentinian habit of adding Che to the end of questions or statements. Che is sort of like the American, huh, or the English, yeah? There's no sinister war name in the story. Before he was Che, Ernesto studied medicine for 2 years, and then famously took a tour throughout Latin America with his friend Alberto Granado, chronicling what he did and saw. His diaries were later published as a book called The Motorcycle Diaries, which was made into a critically acclaimed 2004 film. Interestingly, Alberto Granado was played by Argentinian actor Rodrigo de la Serna, who happens to be a second cousin of Che. For Che, the tour around Latin America revealed things he had only read about growing up: the crushing poverty and the injustice of the economic systems in virtually all of Latin America at the time. Being located in a remote jungle or mountains was hard enough. Still, throughout most of South and Central America, one form or another of the latifundia system was in place. The word is Latin and comes from the self-sustaining and largely self-governing estates of the rich in Roman times. In Latin America, this took the form of large rambling estates, usually owned by a family with a history of wealth, members of the government or army, or worse, to Che and others like him, owned by capitalists, particularly American capitalists, and, in an unspoken way, the American government, who relied on the giant American fruit and petroleum conglomerates for a plentiful, cheap supply of food and gas for Americans. It's important to know that we here at A Day in History are not communists or socialists. However, facts are facts, and a few facts are important to remember. First, the United States dominated the economies of most South and Central American nations after World War II. In Guatemala, the American United Fruit Company owned or controlled nearly half the country's land. Before Castro's and Che's 1959 revolution, American firms owned about 40% of the sugar farms and virtually all cattle ranches in Cuba. 90% of mines in Cuba were owned by American companies, and nearly 80% of the utilities. American banks held significant interests in Cuban banks, and American interests controlled half of the railways in the country. Second, Che was a charismatic, well-educated, and extremely well-read man. With his men in the field and when he held positions of power in Cuba, Che was reportedly stern but fair, and took it upon himself to teach the many illiterate rebels how to read. When speaking to foreigners, giving interviews, or off-duty, he could be funny and very insightful. On tours in Europe and elsewhere, Guevara often left journalists from right-leaning papers or countries stunned and speechless with his answers. Third, the poverty in Latin America and Africa, where Che briefly tried to organize a communist insurgency in 1965, was, and still is, very real. Infant mortality was high. Death from easily preventable diseases was high because of a lack of doctors, education, and medicine. Hunger and sometimes starvation were a regular occurrence. Worse was the general indifference to this suffering by right-wing dictatorships and the American support propping them up, which made it much easier to recruit followers for the communist cause. Those are the facts. It's also a fact that Guevara personally killed a large number of men and women, either directly in field executions or after he became a powerful official in Cuba, and ordered the deaths of many people accused, sometimes rightly, often wrongly, of anti-revolutionary activities. One of the interesting things about Guevara was that despite his ruthlessness towards enemies of the people, he could be quite compassionate to those he empathized with. His trip through South America wasn't just the trip of a young man from a successful family looking for adventure, or to see how the other half lived. Che had had a medical education, and while not a doctor, was trained enough in first aid and basic medical care that he could truly help some of the people he met along the way. A few years later, when a freighter filled with Belgian-made weapons destined for Fidel's army exploded in Havana Harbor, Che was on site, giving first aid. It was not a publicity stunt. For many people, seeing the utter poverty of villages and towns throughout the continent would leave an impact, one which they might talk to their friends about when they got home, but an impact that would fade with time and life. For Che, the trip was life-changing. Having read in both Spanish and French most of history's great philosophers, from the Greeks and Romans to the French existentialists, he was also exposed to leftist political writings and theories in his travels. He became attracted to the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Within a short time, he was calling himself a communist. The events that had truly put Che over the top into becoming a communist true believer was witnessing events in Guatemala in 1954. Democratically elected in 1950, President Jacobo Arbenz had been working to reduce American influence in and ownership of his country. This naturally put him on a collision course with not only powerful American economic interests, but with the Eisenhower administration as well. The more Arbenz pushed, the more the Americans pushed back. fomenting unrest and organizing right-wing paramilitaries. In the days before it was illegal for an American president to order an assassination, at least directly, the Eisenhower administration ordered the CIA to kill Arbenz, though their attempts were unsuccessful. After years of escalating and more brutal conflict, Arbenz stepped down in 1954, after Guatemalan officers supported by the CIA staged a coup d'etat. For Che, in Guatemala at the time, these events pushed him to become a communist through and through. As you heard, Che met Fidel Castro and his brother Raúl, who ruled Cuba for a time after his brother died in 2016, in Mexico City in 1955. In Fidel, Che saw a kindred spirit who also shaped Che's world outlook and vice versa. The Castros were from a wealthy family and had received a private boarding school education. Unlike Che, who was a dyed-in-the-wool communist by the time he traveled to Cuba with the Castros, Fidel was initially more of a Cuban nationalist with an anti-imperialist, meaning anti-American, outlook. Castro's conversion to communism came after his rise to power. A combination of Che's teachings and Castro's moving towards the Soviet Union in the face of American hostility to him. By the Battle of Santa Clara in December of 1958, Che had risen to the rank of commander and was in charge of a large formation of Cuban revolutionaries. Guevara had first shown his ruthlessness, not on the battlefield but in camp, where traitors and captured deserters were given a summary trial and shot, sometimes at Che's orders, sometimes by him directly. Che wrote about this after he was in power, writing that by personally killing the man with a quick shot to the temple, Che had ended the uncomfortable situation for the man and the guerrillas around him. Throughout the rest of his life, Che was noted for a remarkable detachment to violence, which probably bordered on the sociopathic. After the rebels had taken control of Cuba, Guevara was made the head of two crucial aspects of the Cuban government: the National Bank and the Ministry of Industries. At this point, Cuba was, in effect, being run by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, and they sometimes differed about what to do. Che was essentially put in charge of the Cuban economy, and while he operated with relative autonomy, his ideas and those of Castro, who hadn't made the shift into full communism at this point, often differed. Unfortunately for Che, the Cuban economy shrank by nearly 40% within a year or two. With the United States, formerly the biggest importer of Cuban sugar by far, stopping its importation, the lingering effects of the war, and radical planning that threw out everything old, including the things that worked, Cuba was forced to import food, gas, and more from other nations. The only ones that would deal with Cuba were the communist regimes of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The Soviets saw the revolution in Cuba as their in the Western Hemisphere. With an entire nation going communist just 90 miles from American shores, Cuba could be the center of a communist revolution in Latin America, weakening American power there. Within a short time, the Soviets were sending millions of dollars worth of weapons to Cuba. At first, small arms and artillery, then fighter planes and anti-aircraft missiles. In 1961, shortly after Kennedy took office in the United States, American-backed right-wing Cuban rebels landed at the Bay of Pigs, about 120 miles southeast of Havana on Cuba's southern coast. The entire operation was a fiasco, and the Castro and Che's regime was never remotely threatened by it. However, the Bay of Pigs was a warning to the Cubans that the United States was willing to use force openly against them. And next time, it might not be a few hundred Cuban exiles, but the full weight of the US military. And this is what led Castro and Che to accept the Soviet offer to place nuclear-capable ballistic missiles in Cuba. These missiles could go from launch to impact in Washington, D.C. in 13 minutes, something which no American administration could tolerate. The story of the Cuban Missile Crisis is well known. After 13 agonizing days, the Soviets agreed to move their medium-range missiles from Cuba, among other things. What most people didn't know was that while the Soviets retained control over them, Che had called for the use of nuclear missiles should the United States attempt an invasion. What's more, what the USA did not know until the 1990s was that Soviet tactical nuclear weapons, some fired from artillery, remained in Cuba into the 1980s, and that Che had advocated their use after the crisis had ended. Throughout his life, Che harbored a fanatical hatred for the American regime, not the people, but the capitalist system. By the mid-1960s, Che's influence in Cuba was waning. He had publicly admitted that he had made mistakes in running the Cuban economy, stepped down from his positions in Cuba, and committed himself to world revolution. In April 1965, Che traveled to Africa for a goodwill tour for Cuba, which he excelled at. After a few months in Africa, he briefly returned to Cuba, assembled a small cadre of Cuban military advisors, all who had fought in the revolution, and went to the Congo to begin what he hoped would become a continent-wide communist revolution. Che was a brilliant revolutionary organizer, but Africa, despite being even poorer than most countries in Latin America, was not like Latin America in most other ways. Most people were illiterate at the time. Most had never heard of communism. Many had no conception of the outside world. Even though Che spoke French, which was widely spoken in the capital of the former French colony, hardly anyone else outside Kinshasa did. Making things worse was the climate. And though Che had always fought through it all of his life, the asthma attacks he had in Africa were debilitating. After a few months, Che left Africa to begin a new revolution, this time in Bolivia. Before his death, Che was a popular figure in Cuba and worldwide. In 1960, at the memorial service for the victims of the freighter explosion, photojournalist Alex Corda took one of the 20th century's most famous photographs. The photo was published in Cuban papers and a couple of international papers at the time. But it wasn't until after Che was killed in 1967 that college students in the US and Europe, and especially France, began papering their walls with Corda's picture. By 1967, the Vietnam War was in full swing. The civil rights movement was spreading throughout the US, and many people were looking for alternatives to the system. In 1969, Che was even memorialized in Hollywood by what many critics called one of the 5 worst movies ever made. Che starred Egyptian movie star Omar Sharif as Che and white American Jack Palance as Castro. It went downhill from there, which is sad because Che Guevara was a fascinating man, despite his many flaws and ruthless adherence to a truly oppressive form of government. On Christmas Day 1989, Romania and the Romanians received the greatest gift in their history. The dreaded dictator Nicolae Ceaușescu was executed, along with his especially hated wife Elena. Ceaușescu had been known as the Conducător, the leader. Not an original title for a dictator for sure, but another Romanian dictator, Ion Antonescu, who had allied himself with Hitler, also used the name. Antonescu was shot by the Soviets in 1946. No politician in Romania today on a local, provincial, or national level calls themselves that, and likely never will. Ceaușescu had other titles that he preferred, but his wife loved them. She was the best mother Romania could have and the mother of the nation. She also liked to pose as a world-renowned scientist, and though virtually all of her credentials were fake, she was still known as the great scientist of international renown. The news and the truth were tightly controlled in Ceaușescu's Romania. Outside of the country, at least outside the communist bloc, she was known as a real power in the country, but not a scientist or intellectual of any kind. 3 days before Christmas, Ceausescu walked onto a large balcony in the building of the Central Committee of the Communist Party to make a speech. Over the past year, communism in Eastern Europe had begun to crumble. By the time Ceausescu walked onto the balcony, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria had overthrown their communist systems. East Germany had essentially ceased to exist when the Berlin Wall crumbled in November. Having been in power since 1965 and having ruled the country with possibly the most pervasive secret police force in history, Ceausescu was determined to keep power at any cost. He walked out onto that balcony and began to speak in the same threatening and paranoid language communists had been using since the Soviet Union became the first communist nation in 1917-18. Romania's problems were the result of foreign interference and hooliganism. These fascist provocations by reactionary circles and foreign agents were aimed at destroying the perfect state that could be part of a bright future, if only they would listen to him. Well, they had listened to or been forced to listen to him for 24 years and wouldn't listen to him any longer. Many of the 100,000 or so people in the plaza below him had been bussed in from other parts of the country to hear him and cheer him. Before the anti-communist revolutions of 1989 had brought down all but two communist nations, Yugoslavia and Albania, no one would have dared to do anything but cheer, but not today. After about 9 minutes of the same old thing, and having seen or heard through word of mouth and an underground press that the other people of the Soviet bloc had overthrown their own leaders, and for the most part peacefully, the people below the conductor began to chant, move menacingly closer to the building, and then began to call for the end of the regime and Ceausescu's blood, Elena's too. They ran with their personal security and escaped the capital by helicopter, landing in the small town of Snagov and then on to Târgoviște, a small city about 50 miles from Bucharest, the capital. All through his panicked flight, Ceausescu attempted to contact and organize a military response to the uprising. But having seen the writing on the wall in the rest of Eastern Europe and hearing about what had happened in the capital, officers and men throughout Romania were either walking away or joining the opposition. By the time the couple had arrived in Târgoviște, the local garrison, who were commanded by Ceausescu's former defense minister, who had wisely switched sides, were waiting for the conductor and the scientist of great renown and took them to the local military base. 2.5 days after his last speech, Ceausescu was put on trial. He had ruled the country for 24 years. His trial, if you can call it that, lasted 1 hour. His appointed defense team acted more like a second set of prosecutors when given the opportunity to ask questions of their client. Almost every time Ceausescu tried to speak, he was shouted down. When his wife tried to defend him, the people in the hall nearly went berserk. Everyone knew, except maybe the conductor himself, what the verdict would be. And when it came, it took about 15 minutes to get the former power couple up against the wall of the base infirmary, handcuffed. No blindfolds were offered. 3 paratroopers stood before them and quickly opened fire, emptying their magazines into the couple. Within certain circles in Romania, there had been a hope for a lengthy trial, not to help Ceausescu, but to allow the Romanian people to see exactly how much of a monster Ceausescu really was. In Western Europe and the United States, politicians and pundits, while not at all sad about the conductor's death, also wanted to see the rule of law re-established in Romania, and hoped that a trial would have helped to do that. In Romania, most people were happy the couple was dead, and most, if they could, would gladly repeat the action. First and foremost, Ceausescu, who was born in 1918 and who became a communist in the 1930s, idolized Stalin. As Romania bordered the Soviet Union, This was a good idea if you were a communist, even if they weren't in power yet. By the 1930s, and especially in the last part of the decade, Stalin had created a state so completely in control of its citizens' lives, especially in the cities, that for decades, diplomats and historians considered it the most complete of the infamous totalitarian states of the 20th century. Though it is a matter of debate, many historians think Ceausescu might have done Stalin's better. His secret police, the Securitate, was figuratively and literally everywhere. In a country of 23 million in 1989, nearly 500,000 were employed directly or indirectly by the secret police. Propaganda and fear made it seem like more. After the Ceausescu regime, it was revealed in secret police files that every phone in the country was bugged. Not only that, but most apartments and houses in the cities were bugged as well. The Romanian countryside, then and now, was much poorer than the cities, and people there mostly concentrated on just getting by. But many of their homes and cottages were bugged too. What the listening devices didn't hear was often picked up by informers, most of the time family members and co-workers. More often than you would think, members of the same family informed on each other without knowing it. Before you ask, a polite no thank you to the Securitate's offer often meant arrest, beatings, torture, long prison terms, and many times disappearances. So husbands and wives, children and their parents informed on each other. And the Securitate knew if you were lying too, because they had informers everywhere. At your work, at the bar you went to after work, in your building, and at home. Lie to the Securitate and you can expect to land in one of the most brutal penal systems on Earth. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, before Ceausescu became leader, while he was a rising star in the party, hardcore Stalinists had taken control of the Romanian Communist Party. At that time, Stalin was at the height of his power, and with him and his huge army just across the border, Romanian Stalinists wanted to impress him with their ruthlessness in hunting down foreign agents and enemies of the state within the Communist Party. It was also a good time to simply get rid of enemies as well. The experiment read like something out of a political thriller. The goal was to see if a person could be broken so completely that they would not only do what you asked, but would believe that what you asked was the right thing to do. On some occasions, prisoners were forced to shoot or bludgeon other prisoners to death. If they showed remorse, guess who was next? Some were seldom touched but were forced to watch the torture of others, to break them both psychologically and emotionally. Just like the Nazis did in their camps, certain prisoners were given extra food and perks for tormenting, beating, electrocuting, hanging, and waterboarding other prisoners. When the people in charge of the program decided to make a power play for control, the rest of the party had had enough. By some miracle, this happened just after Stalin died in 1953. Many of the people running the experiment were executed, including the prisoners who were forced to torture and kill others for perks. But the Securitate remembered and used these techniques and new ones to torture and terrify their countrymen and women. Romania is slightly smaller than the US state of Oregon. It had 44 prisons and 72 labor camps. When Ceausescu first came to power, many political prisoners were released, and a number of prisons and camps closed. But it didn't take long for them to reopen. Ceausescu was rather popular when he first came to power in 1965 to 66. The closing of prisons and a wide-ranging amnesty for political prisoners were announced. Internationally, Ceausescu slowly steered a careful course between the USSR and the West, setting himself up as a kind of diplomatic go-between and also an independent thinker, not cowed by the post-Stalin Soviet leadership. In 1969, US President Nixon became the first American president to visit a communist nation. The two leaders got on so well that Ceausescu visited Nixon in the White House in 1970. He visited President Ford in 1973. His last visit was in 1978 during the Carter administration. Did the Americans know what was going on in Romania? Without a doubt. They may not have known every brutal detail, but they knew enough. Why the visits then? Precisely because Ceausescu had distanced his country from Russia, though he knew not to distance Romania too far. Throughout Ceausescu's rule, Romania was a desperately poor country, though he did spend what today would amount to billions of dollars on making Bucharest a modern communist showcase city. However, Romania was desperately poor in the smaller towns and the countryside. In 1970, a farm village with a tractor was considered very fortunate. Most people were still following oxen behind plows. Over time, living conditions improved because Ceausescu had seized control of the economy and used tax revenue and money from the many illegal operations that he and the Securitate were involved in. They trafficked guns throughout Europe and the Middle East. They imported and distributed drugs in Eastern Europe. Cigarettes and foreign currency were stolen and sold on the black market and put in Ceausescu's and Elena's personal accounts. Worst of all were the hostage plans. Romania has always had a problem with anti-Semitism. In World War II, the fascist regime of Antonescu perpetrated some of the war's worst horrors at the massacre of Romanian Jews at Iași, where an estimated 15,000 people were slaughtered and starved to death. However, when the winds of World War II shifted and it appeared that Hitler would lose, the persecution of Romanian Jews began to ease slowly. Out of an estimated pre-war Jewish population of 600,000 to 700,000, about half survived the war years. By the time Ceausescu came to power in 1965, the war had been over for 20 years, and the remaining Jews of Romania tried to rebuild their lives. Still, life was tough. General discrimination and bullying, in addition to the oppressiveness of a communist regime, made a lot of Romanian Jews want to leave the country. But that seemed impossible until Ceausescu came to the rescue. Using vaguely threatening language, he proposed to Israel a deal: his remaining Jews for hard US and European currency. Basically, the Jews of Romania were hostages. With the goal of bringing as many of the world's Jews to Israel, the Israelis jumped at the chance. So did the Germans, which may sound odd, but interestingly enough, Romania had a sizable ethnic German population and had for centuries. After World War II, no one in Romania had any use for Germans, so Ceausescu sold them to West Germany, which paid in today's money between $2.5 and $3.5 billion for them. The Israelis paid an approximate $300 million. Though most people left the country in the late 1960s and early 70s, Romanian Jews and Germans were still being ransomed off as late as 1989. This money did not go to buy a tractor for poor Romanian farmers. No, these funds and much else went into building Ceausescu's home, the world's largest private residence. Prepare yourself. Ceausescu's home, really the world's ugliest palace, was 3.9 million square feet, or 365,000 square meters. Real gold covered everything. The finest marble was imported from Italy. No expense was spared. In 2025, the house would cost nearly $5 billion. Some communists. Though Ceausescu was often seen in poorly fitting suits as a proper communist and man of the people, Elena went all out. While her shoe collection wasn't as extensive as the Philippines' First Lady Imelda Marcos's 3,000 pair shoe collection, she had nearly 1,000. She also had hundreds of furs and some of the most expensive jewelry in the world. Still, as Romanians of the time liked to say, very carefully and quietly, no amount of fur or jewelry would make the great scientific mind a beauty queen, though she was determined to see herself that way, and insisted others did too. Elena hated being in a room with actual beautiful women, and reportedly enjoyed seeing them publicly humiliated. While Ceausescu was being wined and dined in Washington and worldwide, and spending the nation's money, people all over Romania began to suffer. By the late 1980s, the Soviet economy, as well as the economies of the rest of Eastern Europe, had begun to shrink. Reagan's defense spending and the corrupt nature of every communist government made it impossible for Romania to thrive. Suffering the most were the children. Those of you old enough to recall remember the constant news stories about the Romanian orphanages discovered after the fall of the regime. Children who looked like concentration camp survivors. Some were so underdeveloped from malnutrition that brain damage had occurred. 13-year-olds were as smart and underdeveloped as 7-year-olds and much more. You don't need to imagine very hard all of the other abuses that children and young teens suffered in the orphanages. They were there for two main reasons. Both parents were classified as enemies of the state, and the kids were taken from home and dumped into run-down orphanages, which were often abandoned buildings or warehouses. Other children had been pushed out of the house because the parents did not have enough money to feed them. Most of the country's wealth had gone directly into the pockets of Ceausescu, Elena, their children, and cronies. Just days before he was captured and executed, Ceausescu had ordered the arrest of a prominent pastor in the town of Timișoara. Though Romania was officially atheist, a few churches were allowed to stay open, heavily monitored. When Pastor Laszlo Toakesh began denouncing the regime, the arrest order went out. To protect their pastor, townspeople surrounded the building he was in, and though Toakesh survived, over 100 people were shot in the street or executed. 3 days later, the conductor made his last speech. On April 28, 1945, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini and his mistress Clara Petacci were captured by Italian partisans and executed. Their bodies were then taken to Milan, where the Italian public and journalists from around the world could see that the feared, hated, and incompetent dictator was dead. Upon seeing his body, the mob went crazy and began to spit on and beat his body until it was almost unrecognizable. In blunt terms, they kicked and stomped his head so much that when they were done, it was virtually flat. One of the territories that Mussolini ruled over was Libya, which had become an Italian colony in 1911. Until Mussolini's takeover, Italian rule in Libya was oppressive, but not completely intolerable. For the most part, the Italians were content if taxes and bribes were paid, the oil fields kept pumping, and no one caused too much trouble. When Mussolini came to power, that began to change, and by the late 1930s, the Italians and Mussolini were hated figures. Fast forward to Libya in 2011. Ruled by the eccentric and brutal dictator Muammar Gaddafi since 1969, the Libyans had had enough. All over the Arab world, beginning in the North African nation of Tunisia, a wave of revolt against authoritarian governments known as the Arab Spring began. A few months after the wave of revolt began and spread to Libya, Gaddafi was found by Libyan rebels who had taken over much of the country. With the aid of American intelligence and a French airstrike, Gaddafi was driven out of his 80-car entourage and into a drainpipe. As rebels flooded into the area, they found the former dictator, pulled him out of the drain pipe and dragged him into an open area, beating him all the way. The entire time, a cell phone camera was recording the scene. There could not have been a more frightened-looking man on the planet, and if you've seen the video, you can understand why. He pled for his life, repeating an Arabic phrase, "Haram alayko," shame on you, which is actually a plea to live. Alongside Gaddafi were members of his infamous female bodyguard, known as the Amazons, which you may have seen a parody of in the Sacha Baron Cohen comedy The Dictator. This shot that killed Gaddafi was reportedly fired by a young man wearing a Yankees baseball cap. How the mighty had fallen. Both Mussolini and Gaddafi had once been popular, but years of repressive rule, extrajudicial killings, and torture had finally caused them to be murderously hated. Muammar Muhammad Abu Minyar al-Gaddafi was born in 1942, ironically the last year of the Italian occupation of the country. Throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Libya was a desperately poor country, and Gaddafi was Bedouin, the nomadic group famous the world over for their ability to survive in one of the harshest climates in the world, the Sahara Desert. Life for Gaddafi and all Bedouin was exceedingly hard, not only because of the climate, but because many, if not most of the non-Bedouin people of North Africa looked down upon them as poor, ignorant drovers, barely more intelligent than the animals they owned. In one way, Gaddafi was lucky though. He had the opportunity to attend tribal schools. Many other Bedouin boys his age were discouraged or forbidden to attend school. They were needed to help their families. In his late teens, he attended the Royal Military Academy, and upon graduation, he did two things. He began a secret group of officers called the Free Officers Movement and rose to the rank of captain. The Free Officers Movement was an Arab nationalist and Nasserist movement. Nasserist was the term used to describe followers of Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser, who envisioned an Arab empire spanning North Africa and the Arab Middle East. Nasser's ideas were influential throughout the Middle East. One of the things they called for was the ouster of all of the old Arab dynasties and governments and replacing them with so-called republics, which soon turned into one-party dictatorships in other countries, including Iraq, where Saddam Hussein took over, and Syria, where Hafez al-Assad, father of recently deposed Bashar al-Assad, began his brutal rule. Throughout most of his early military career, Gaddafi was involved in pan-Arab thought, and secretly, movements. He was widely regarded as extremely intelligent, but a bit eccentric. He was also ruthless, and at age 27, he led a bloodless military coup against King Idris I, who had governed the country since the end of Italian rule. Though he could have promoted himself to general or field marshal, he only raised his rank by 2 steps, to colonel, which is how he was known to most people in Libya and around the world, at least for the first part of his rule. Like many other leaders who emerged and overthrew an unpopular regime, Gaddafi was widely regarded in Libya, especially in the capital, Tripoli, as a vibrant, intelligent, and charismatic young leader. Like most other future dictators, Gaddafi promised a new golden age of Arab nationalism, peace, economic equality, prosperity, and freedom. But within a short time, anyone who disagreed with his vision, or rather his path to it, was in deep trouble. In the mid-1960s, the People's Republic of China was going through Mao Zedong's insane Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, or just the Cultural Revolution for short. One of the most famous pictures of Mao at this time was him standing in front of an enormous crowd of screaming young people holding and waving what is known as his Little Red Book, which was a collection of quotes by Mao that the people of China were expected to learn by heart, and which became famous or infamous around the world, depending on where you stood on bizarre communist theory. Inspired by the power and influence of Mao's Little Red Book, in the early 1970s, Gaddafi published his Green Book, green being the color of Islam, likely a political move since Gaddafi seemed to give lip service to Islam rather than any genuine belief. The Green Book contained many comments on Islam that deviated from mainstream teaching, but were not fundamentalist either, but a strange combination of Islamic beliefs, criticism of Islamic teachers and clerics, and Gaddafi's own beliefs. Throughout his reign, Gaddafi intimidated and used clerics to push his own theories about religion, life, and politics. Every Libyan was told to memorize the Green Book, even though at the time many of them could not read. Of course, it wasn't expected that every person would memorize the entire thing, but it was always good to have a few phrases memorized and ready if questioned by the police or a government official. If they chose to, Gaddafi's police could jail someone almost indefinitely on the pretext that they didn't know the Green Book well enough, which was a pretty open-ended threat. The Green Book spelled out Gaddafi's beliefs about politics and government, and the theories of Gaddafi in the book became known, at least in Libya, as the Third International Theory, the other two being capitalism and communism. Gaddafi called for Libya to be run as a direct democracy, with local people's committees running things both locally and nationally. Though these committees were supposed to be chosen by vote, in reality they were populated by men and occasionally women, which angered conservative religious elements in the country who were loyal to Gaddafi only. At the highest level, Gaddafi's yes men ran the country and quashed any opposition. Within a very short time, Libyans learned that a big part of Gaddafi's Third International Theory was about keeping Gaddafi in power. Soon, people reported to have spoken against the colonel were disappearing from the streets of Libya's biggest cities: Tripoli, Benghazi, Sirte, and others. Before long, Libya was now officially known as the Great Socialist People's Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. The closest English translation for Jamahiriya is Republic, but it has other meanings and is often used to describe the masses or the public. Almost no dictator can stay in power long unless they give the people at least some of what was promised. In the first decade or so of Gaddafi's rule, many Libyans overlooked the human rights abuses that began to occur more and more frequently, because important aspects of their lives began to get better. For instance, Gaddafi instituted a program of free healthcare and education, subsidized housing, food for the poor, and electricity with government funds, most of which came from the newly nationalized oil industry, which displeased quite a few Western companies who had controlled Libya's relatively ample oil supply. In the first half or so of Gaddafi's rule, living standards for most Libyans improved, and the colonel enjoyed a period of genuine popularity. However, as time passed, corruption on a grand scale began to permeate Libyan society. Libya's oil wealth, while not approaching that of Saudi Arabia or Iraq, was more than enough for Gaddafi's government and inner circle officials to enjoy a luxurious life. Gaddafi became one of the richest men in the region, if not the world. However, as Gaddafi and his men got richer, the funds for Gaddafi's projects began to dry up, and many remained half-finished or had not even begun, as funds and equipment began to disappear. However, one project, the Great Man-Made River Project, tapped a vast but finite freshwater aquifer in the desert. The project was relatively successful and is still one of the largest, if not the largest, underground network of pipes and aqueducts. As you can imagine, bringing more water to people in a desert country was quite popular. But towards the end of Gaddafi's rule and today, maintenance on the project suffers from civil strife, corruption, and a lack of materials. As time went by, things began to change. First, Gaddafi became increasingly erratic and unpredictable, but his intelligence and cunning were never questioned throughout his rule, though his judgment often was. Over time, especially as hard economic times hit Libya and the world in the late 1970s and corruption spread throughout the country, more Libyans began to protest and complain against Gaddafi's policies. By this time, Gaddafi's secret police, known as the Mukhabarat, the intelligence services or secret police, had infiltrated all levels of Libyan society, especially in the cities, and especially among college students and young adults. In the last years of the 1970s, Gaddafi began to commit some of the worst crimes of his rule. To instill fear and intimidate the populace, Gaddafi held public executions. In the cities and towns where they occurred, attendance, even for school children, was required. And the secret and uniformed police and military made sure that everyone in attendance shouted Gaddafi's name or quotes from the Green Book. In Tripoli especially, executions became large events and were often held in sports stadiums and on university campuses. They were also televised. In 1984, student Sadiq Hamed Shwedi was hanged on live TV, after having been dragged before a court, also on live TV. A handcuffed and sitting Shwedi cried and begged for his life as the court labeled him an agent of America and of the radical fundamentalist Muslim Brotherhood, two polar opposites. He was also accused of plotting against Gaddafi. None of these things were true, but Shwedi's student visit to the US and his attendance at an anti-Gaddafi protest sealed his fate. His trial took place in a basketball stadium, where the judges and witnesses against him, as well as members of the audience, jeered and accused him of more and more outrageous crimes. A makeshift gallows was quickly erected on the court, and Shwedi was hanged.
في الأعمال الإرهابية السابق الإشارة إليها التي أقرها المؤتمر بالإعدام شنقا حتى الموت.
As anyone familiar with the process can tell you, an efficient hanging is a relatively quick death, but if done wrong, it can take a very long, painful time. As Shwedi dangled from the rope choking, on live TV, one of Gaddafi's Amazons, known as Huda the Executioner, hung from Shwedi's legs until his neck broke. Additionally, one of Shwedi's cousins had been killed in a raid against a suspected coup by a militant organization bent on ridding Libya of Gaddafi. 2,000 people were rounded up, and 12 were hanged publicly. Throughout much of Gaddafi's reign, hangings were broadcast, sometimes live, sometimes broadcast after the fact. They were often rebroadcast on the country's controlled TV channels, frequently interrupting other programs at random. Gaddafi's secret police, like many others in the Arab world at the time, were known for their cruelty. People in police custody were subject to a variety of torture, including electric shock, waterboarding, mock executions, beatings, and the infamous torture known worldwide as falanga in the Middle East and bastinado in Europe. Though it might sound like a less painful alternative to electrocution and waterboarding, falanga grows from painful to agonizing very quickly. Women and girls taken into custody were often subject to rape. long terms of imprisonment, and sometimes simply disappeared, never to be seen again. In late June 1996, a protest occurred at the Abu Salim prison in Tripoli. The prisoners were protesting a ration cut that had been imposed after 2 men had escaped. The day after the protest began, soldiers and police entered the grounds and began shooting and throwing grenades. Over 1,200 prisoners were killed. By 1996, Gaddafi, who for a very short time had been popular in some circles in democratic countries when he first took power, had become an enemy of the established world order. Beginning in the 70s and continuing almost until the day he died, Gaddafi provided huge amounts of money and arms to well-known terrorist and militant organizations. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, the Irish Republican Army, IRA, and the Italian Communist Red Brigades all enjoyed regular infusions of cash and weapons from Libya. Despite his growing list of appalling human rights abuses in his own country, for many people around the world, especially in the West, Gaddafi was reviled, but often dismissed as a sort of madman who ruled a remote and underpopulated desert country. But in 1988, that changed. 2 years before, at the La Belle discotheque in West Berlin, a popular hangout for US servicemen, a bomb exploded, killing 3 and injuring many more. Investigations by the German and US governments put the blame squarely on Gaddafi and his intelligence forces. A few days later, US President Ronald Reagan ordered airstrikes on Libya, which resulted in several civilian casualties. Among the dead was Gaddafi's adopted daughter. On December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103, flying over Lockerbie, Scotland, en route to Kennedy Airport in New York, exploded in mid-air, raining debris and body parts throughout the countryside near the small Scottish town. All 270 people on board and 11 people on the ground were killed. In many ways, the bombing began the downfall of Gaddafi, though his final end was over 2 decades away. From 1988 until 2011, American, British, and French air forces occasionally struck targets in Libya, including terrorist training camps in the desert. A variety of tough economic sanctions was also imposed on Libya, and arms slowly began to find their way into the hands of the small but growing anti-Gaddafi movements throughout the country and the region. One of the last times that Americans saw Gaddafi before his widely publicized execution was in 2009. Though he was an enemy of America and a proven terrorist, the US had to let Gaddafi into a UN meeting, taking place in September. No hotel would give Gaddafi and his entourage a room, so he proposed erecting the large and luxurious Bedouin tent he had brought in Central Park. New York authorities refused to grant him a permit. Then, Gaddafi was saved from an embarrassing situation by a New York real estate mogul and self-promoter named Donald Trump, who rented space to Gaddafi on land he owned in nearby Bedford, New York. But after a couple of days, the town council and zoning commission ordered the tent taken down. 2 years later, Trump's Libyan friend was killed by the mob.